and you are listening to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your host, John Wood Jr. Okay, folks, welcome back to the podcast. Welcome back, loyal listeners, Braver Angels members, subscribers, folks that are following the work, following the movement, and pushing for a stronger, more united United States of America and a more peaceful, kinder, more empathetic world. I'm very pleased, ladies and gentlemen, to be joined by a person who I've developed just an immense amount of admiration and respect for in a short period of time. We are joined today by maybe our first guest from across the pond, as they say, which is a pleasure in and of itself. Ayishat Akanbi is a fashion stylist. She is a writer and a cultural commentator with a point of view that I think just needs to be broadcast around the globe and heard more in the United States. I'm very pleased and blessed to be joined by her on today's Braver Angels podcast. Ayisha, how you doing today?
I'm well. Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to speak with you. And likewise, I am also very inspired and admire your journey and the work that you're doing.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. As you know, the feeling is mutual. Ayisha, where exactly are you joining us from today? I know that you're in the UK, but where are you specifically?
So I'm in London, specifically South London, a place called Croydon. That's where I'm at today.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, so there's so many places we could begin this conversation, and an hour really isn't a long period of time when you've got a lot of things in common to talk about. And so I'm just going to jump right in here with some opening thoughts. Now, obviously, I'm in the United States of America. Just so you know, I'm speaking to you from Los Angeles, California.
Okay.
And one thing you probably know about the U.S. is that it's kind of, in many respects, it's almost like a bunch of countries wrapped up into one. We are at this particular moment, and, you might say that, of course, geographically, but, in terms of our ethnic diversity, religious diversity, and so forth, the United States is an incredible experiment. And I know that the United Kingdom is similar in many respects. We're dealing with a serious identity crisis in the United States of America right now. Political polarization is at an all-time high just in terms of the conventional political divide. I know, we have Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, and a bunch of different types of folks kind of in between the categories. But even more volatile than that, and this contributes to the politics, but we have a racial division between, white folks and black folks, but it includes a much larger spectrum of ethnic identities and so forth, within which we are having a difficult sort of time deciding whether or not this is an endemically racist country whose institutions are perverted by age-old prejudices and bigotries through which lens we ought to see all of our social interactions now, or the other narrative is something along the lines of the United States of America transcended racism a generation ago with the civil rights movement. Things are largely equal, except that we've got a bunch of frustrated young activists, white and black and brown and yellow, et cetera, who just can't get their minds around the idea that it's personal responsibility that should be sort of leading us to a better future and not making up grievances about racism, et cetera. So without going any further into, my kind of cavalier analysis there, I'm wondering in the UK, what is parallel and what is different in your view between how you see things playing out socially and politically in the United States versus what you observe around you in the general politics of Great Britain?
Well, I would say that we seem to be going through a very similar moment in terms of the political polarization. That's one thing. The racial tension, largely between black and white. Maybe you could say the intergenerational split, young people against so-called boomers. I think one of the consequences of having the internet is we often sort of take the same narratives on. And as America is such a cultural influence all over the world. And especially for a lot of Black British people, I do think we have, responded to a lot of the racial incidents that have happened in very similar ways. So let's say in relation to George Floyd, that brought up a conversation about police brutality. I'd say ever since Trayvon Martin, which was maybe 2012, I think, there has been a national and largely global conversation happening in regards to racial relations. And yep, the UK is very much a part of that. So you are likely to get a lot of activists, young people, academics here who look at Britain in a very similar way to how many people, Black Americans, would look at the American situation. Where I sit is slightly different. I wouldn't say that walking around and in my day-to-day life, and I grew up actually in a largely white town. So I grew up in a place called Southampton, which is maybe an hour and a half from London. And it's generally like a white working class city, maybe upper working class, but, you don't necessarily get tons of, affluent people there. And I can't say, in my 32 years of, existence that race and racism has been much of an issue for me, not even at all, which isn't to say that I haven't experienced racism, because I definitely have. And I think that's likely to happen in any place where you are a minority within a majority, but not to the extent that I can call it a trauma or anything that seems to have hindered me.
Right. Now that raises, first of all, I can attest to sort of a similar experience in my own life. So I grew up in Culver City, California, which is sort of a suburban part of LA County. It's actually where the motion picture studios are located. So, everybody thinks of Hollywood as being the center of entertainment, and it is, but the actual filming takes place in the studios in Culver City. It is a very diverse community. The school district I went to is now listed, I think, as the 4th most diverse district in America. But, most of the people around me growing up were white, but very multicultural community. A lot of Asians, Jewish people, Middle Easterners, and Blacks and Latinos. I have never thought of myself as being a victim of racism, not for one moment in my upbringing. And the thing is I grew up in a community that was so well integrated, I just, and my own family is biracial. So my father is white, my mother is Black. I always felt entirely sort of accepted in my community. It didn't mean that I didn't have an identity struggle of my own related to race. I did.
But I would say the same. Yeah.
Right. But it was never so much in the context of feeling as if white people in general had anything against me. I can list a few anecdotes of racially insensitive altercations I've had with people who have said things that were mean and hurtful, but not to the point of trauma in my life. Now, having said that, I'm married to a woman who grew up in inner city Los Angeles, where I'm speaking to you from now. Actually, I myself have raised a family in the inner city here, but my wife grew up in the Jordan Downs projects in Watts, and I've written about the difference in our experiences growing up. And her experience growing up was far more challenging than mine. Far more challenging relationships between the Black community and the inner city and law enforcement. More challenging relationships, I think, between the community and representatives of the educational system, teachers, social workers, etc. For all sorts of complex reasons, I have a great deal of understanding, I think, for people who have had a Black experience in America that is rooted in a much more complicated cluster of systemic and cultural interactions than what I had. Perhaps a more tense and kind of friction-laden, series of interactions. So I'm wondering, in Great Britain, is there this phenomenon of Black communities being concentrated in urban environments where the surrounding social landscape is kind of different in a meaningful way, in a way that might predictably produce kind of a different experience than yours? Or is that perhaps not as true in England as it would be here in the United States?
No, so you definitely do have different parts of the city that might have a larger concentration of whether it's Asian people, Jewish people, Black people. And generally in those communities, you know, because although I didn't grow up in that environment, let's say cousins did, who I visited a lot as a young person in London. And it seemed as though, you know, I mean, when you're a kid, I guess you're not as hyper aware of, you know, identity in the same ways. I mean, you are aesthetically, but you're not socially. And it felt to me, you know, because we would all hang and play together and stuff like that, it didn't feel like there was much of an issue. And largely, I would say a lot of Black friends, let's say, that I have in school, Black friends that I have now, they would say that in school, race wasn't much of an issue because they went to predominantly Black schools, or at least very multicultural schools. And it seems at university level and within the workplace where race becomes a lot more politicized and a lot more of an issue. And this is where people report feeling a lot of tension or maybe a lot of discrimination and unfair treatment. But generally speaking, no, I don't often, unless it's a different generation. So like I said, I'm nearly 32, and people who, let's say, may have been teenagers in the late 80s, early 90s, you know, that was a bit of a different climate, you know. So you did have white gangs, if you like, you know, for want of a better word, who were essentially nationalists, white nationalists, you know, and they were infamous for, you know, beating up Black people and just antagonizing Black people, Black men specifically in general. But I would say, you know, things have, they've come along since then, which isn't to say that it's eradicated. I don't know if you can ever eradicate such a thing. But things, I would say, are in a better place, at least socially, you know, in terms of what you experience on a day-to-day level. In terms of institutional and systemic, you know, this is where, you know, the debate comes in.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting that you note that where you see some of the, at least some of the sort of self-identified racial tension as being most acute is in the universities, right? And in these parts of American society, of society both in the UK and in the United States, because that phenomenon is true here too. I mean, I mentioned the inner city experience, but in university campuses, there's clearly a sense for a lot of Black folks and people of color, as well as folks in the LGBTQ community, et cetera, that there are these layers of prejudice. There are these subtle kinds of expressions of racism, of innate biases and so forth that people are struggling against and very, very concerned with. Now, the interesting thing about that to me is that a lot of folks will look at life on university campuses and say, well, wait a second, the very fact that you're here, whether you're a person of color or otherwise, means that you are sort of, you yourself possess a sort of privilege and opportunity that many other people don't have. Isn't there a heightened kind of sensitivity to slights and whatnot that is being overblown in order to connect it with this much more severe history of racism that really shouldn't be characterizing the way we look at things in general in our current moment? Now, where I stand and where I think you stand is somewhere in the space of saying that, well, let me not speak for you. Let me just sort of tell you how I look at these things. I feel like on the one hand, there is certainly a tendency to, I feel like there's some way in which there's a space of social empowerment made available for people who can play up the gravity of their social and emotional and psychological sufferings, because there is simply political ground to be gained by advancing a certain narrative. And so I think there's a way in which some people can cynically sort of profess to see racism in places where all that really exists is some level of cultural ignorance, which we could get through perhaps through an opening of the lanes of communication. On the other hand, I think that there is also this parallel reality where when you step into a context, and you sort of said this a moment ago, where in reference to your own experience, where if you are the only person of a certain identity, a certain phenotype, certain race, ethnicity, and you have a different cultural language, you have different sorts of norms in terms of how you express yourself, carry yourself, certainly there's a feeling of vulnerability that can come along with that, that is real. And there's a genuine systemic question that can attach itself to that in a university complex or in a context or a professional context, et cetera, that raises this question, okay, are there ways in which we can kind of inform the development of our institutions so that they can be more accommodating of people who bring particular gifts, particular strengths, who have to contend with not necessarily being able to fit in an easy way because the culture that exists in a certain space is kind of pre-designed for another group of people, even if it isn't sort of deliberately so. And so I feel like this is a very nuanced kind of dynamic that should be treated with sensitivity. How do you look at it?
Yes, I largely see it in the same way. I wonder sometimes how much we might call genuine curiosity or genuine ignorance that isn't ill-intended but just uninformed. I wonder how much we kind of perceive that to be a deliberate attack on who we are, you know. And let's say if you have grown up in an environment where it is heavily black, or it's heavily, you know, one race sort of dominates in a particular area, and then you are going to a university and all of a sudden this is your first time of actually having to interact with so many different types of people, I think you are likely to come into contact with people who may say things to you that you're not used to hearing, because it's your first time in that environment as well. And I do believe, like you say, I think a lot of these things, these slights and what we call now microaggressions, I do think they can be handled through dialogue. I do think that most people are invested in wanting to be accommodating, you know, even if not necessarily about being a good person, but just wanting to have an easier experience, you know, through life, through university. However, when we are telling people who they are, when we are committed to seeing people through a certain lens, I believe, you know, it's, you know, people get defensive. You know, it's very hard to accept that. And I think that makes a lot of conversations that could be handled with a lot more ease, a lot more difficult.
Right. So I think that this kind of brings us to the crux a little bit of the project that I think that you and I share. Because on the one hand, I don't think that we want to minimize the experiences of people who, by virtue of circumstances that interact with identity's relationship to history, cultural, social, political history, the way these things express themselves and the way the education system functions, the way law enforcement interacts with a certain community. Obviously, I'm speaking from an American kind of centric point of view here, but I imagine there's enough parallel to make this relevant, in the UK as well. You know, we don't want to minimize the suffering of people. On the other hand, we don't want to have a cynical point of view towards folks who may be labeled as more privileged and so forth, but that in aggressively applying certain labels, pushes people out of the conversation who need to be there as honest partners. And therefore, I think that what you and I are trying to do, what we're trying to do at Braver Angels, is sort of create the space and also nurture the sort of language and culture by which, culture of discourse and empathy, by which we are able to understand one another across the differences of our experiences in a way that builds earnest sympathy in deep relationships, as opposed to setting boundary lines and rules by which people are forced to enter conversations on unequal sorts of levels, perhaps in response to the broader inequity of the context in which different groups have related to each other in the past. But even so, it seems like we've got to allow space for people to genuinely connect and genuinely see each other in an eye-to-eye sort of way before we introduce some of the labels that shut down conversation. And so I'm wondering sort of if you see your own work in a similar lens.
Yes, I do. You know, for a long time, I wasn't, you know, I may not have been able to answer that question. I was just curious. And maybe what I understand with my work now is that my curiosity that I just sort of innately have is one that I would like us to have about each other, you know, before we're so quick to be critical and criticize, you know. I would suggest that we're curious about one another and that we get to know one another. And I'm trying to cultivate a space or a perspective that allows the room to do that without, as you say, you know, dismissing the real issues that people are going through. I think the way I see it is, you know, we're all going through things. And whether we see ourselves as going through more than the next person or not, we can't negate the fact that everybody has their own story and it's tough as far as they can see. And so I think I would like us to be more sensitive to that without being fragile to that, you know, without necessarily, maybe that's what I'm trying to cultivate, you know, sensitivity without the fragility, you know, because I think sensitivity is a beautiful thing. I think sensitivity allows us to be thoughtful, empathetic, compassionate. However, fragility, on whichever side it lives, can often make us reactive and defensive and all of the things that makes discourse very strenuous. But I think, you know, I do come from the standpoint that, you know, we do have a lot more in common than we do apart. And I think when we drop, maybe if it's facades or bravado, ego, maybe it's a specific attachment to victimhood. And again, that isn't on one side, whichever side. I think that we get to see this a lot more. And that's what I'm interested in.
So there's a social psychologist and author named Jonathan Haidt who is on he's on our board here at Braver Angels. Yeah, I've interviewed him on the podcast here before. And he's written a number of books, including most recently, I think, a book called The Coddling of the American Mind. But in Jonathan's work, a big part of what he talks about is the sort of debilitating consequences of seeking to sort of shield students and young people in general from things that might be, that might seem to harm them psychologically, that might seem to be insensitive or offensive, is really the word, insulting to people on the basis of the fact that it seems to offend their sense of who they are on an identity level. And so in the United States, and this is likely true elsewhere, you know, we have things like safe spaces on college campuses. We have, interestingly, we have some dormitory arrangements that are reserved for, you know, people of color in certain cases in certain campuses. We have spaces set aside for people of a certain cultural experience. And on the one hand, you know, I can sympathize, I think, with the idea that as people who share a certain culture and have a certain experience, perhaps as a minority group in the context of a larger campus community that is, has a different cultural tilt, that, there may just be some recreational and some communal value in sort of having spaces like a Black student union group or other things where we can convene about the things that we share on that level. On the other hand, if we're doing things to try and sort of, shield one group of people from being able to have a conversation that exposes them to points of view that they might consider offensive, but that nevertheless are going to exist in the wider world, seems like we destroy our opportunity to build the kind of understanding that is necessary to cultivate across these differences. And I think it sort of gives people a feeling that there's license to lash out when somebody says something ignorant. There's license to kind of try and, stamp out somebody's, maybe reputation or standing in a certain context because this person said something or did something that isn't in line with, the social status quo that we're trying to push. We call that cancel culture in the United States. There's a sophisticated conversation to be had about it. Is that a thing in the UK in the same way it is here?
Yes, so we do have safe spaces. And, the language has changed a lot more. I remember, and as a result of the contemporary discourses of the time. And so, just small things like this, I noticed. I was at a friend's place the other day. I think she had it was like a Christmas get together, and, there was a lot of women there and, all had a good time and a good conversation. And I remember when I was leaving, my friend said, "Did you feel safe?" Mm-hmm. And I was like, wow, okay, this is new, mm-hmm. And presumably amongst friends that, I have chosen to visit, the assumption would be that I feel safe and comfortable with them.
Right.
But I think now we are being encouraged, and I think what people are doing is they're trying to be extra thoughtful, because I think they are understanding that, some people are going through things that you may know nothing about, whereas I would say all people are. But I think people believe that, some people have a harder time in society because of their identity, and therefore they need extra protection. So whether it's safe spaces on college campuses, or just lots more groups in general. So just even like club nights, even lots of things, are becoming safe spaces or are becoming events for only X type of people. And me personally, I think it's, again, I think I understand and sympathize with the intention. So it seems to me that we're trying to politicize our way out of reality, because the truth is we will interact with people of different ethnic backgrounds, and we need to know how to navigate those situations. We need to know that not everybody who has a different experience, cultural experience to us, won't be able to relate to us. This idea that if we are of different ethnic backgrounds, then we have nothing in common seems false. Well, not even seems, it is false. And the encouragement to see life through that way, I can't see being helpful. And I think it's why we have the fallout and the tensions that we are having at the moment. And also I think there is, which people don't often consider, is, what does it mean to suggest that, Black women specifically, or Black queer women, if you like, are innately more fragile than everybody else? That's not something that, every woman can resonate with. In fact, a lot of us feel like it is our identities being in the minority that have given us a particular strength, that have allowed us to overcome certain mental obstacles or maybe even social obstacles. And so to have someone assume and project onto us that we can't handle things, or we can't maybe take a joke, or that, you know, every time that we get around someone who might say something insensitive that's going to trigger us into, I don't know, some PTSD, I think is, again, I think it's unwise. You know, I often feel that people should talk from their experience. So, you know, what maybe needs to happen, but maybe people don't do this because they don't feel like it will gain as much credibility and validity, is if maybe someone says, I personally don't feel comfortable with this, as opposed to Black people, Black women. You know, I don't think that's a call anybody can make.
Well, yeah, and you know, there's a certain irony in that too, because one of the things that you know, many Black folks will complain about in America, and of course, I have experienced this phenomenon more times than I can count too. So I understand where it comes from. Is stepping into maybe a room, classroom, you know, conference room full of white people, and then suddenly being appointed as sort of the de facto representative of Black America, right? Or all Black people everywhere. And now that's never bothered me too much, but I can see how that would be, you know, a burden for some folks. I'm the type of person who, if you ask me a question, I'll answer just because that's what I do for a living anyway, you know? So I have that temperament. But at the same time, you'll still have a lot of folks who have that complaint on the one hand, be very on the other hand, make statements on behalf of all Black America or all Black people everywhere, just sort of voluntarily. Black people don't like it when certain folks do X, Y, and Z. You know, Black folks don't like it when you know, like, you know, don't touch my hair, don't ask me about my name, so on and so forth. That doesn't necessarily count for everybody, you know. And
equally, I would say, sorry to cut in. Equally, you know, there is a narrative where if you are the only Black person in the room and they don't ask you your opinion, that's also, you know, that can also be a problem for a lot of people. Right. You know, some people will say that, well, why aren't you asking the Black person in the room? You know, so there isn't, I often see through this framework or this worldview, there isn't many ways that you can win.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's the frustration of a lot of people. But to throw a little bit of you know, another curveball into this, I can still understand how, let me put it like this. I do think that there is definitely a lot of room for empathy within, you know, within the Black community, within the diaspora, let's say, in terms of different versions of the African-American experience itself. Understanding the way in which, Ayisha, your and my experience, I think, is likely to give us a different sort of angle on things than that of other Black folks, and extending this empathy that we want to see between the racial groups, within the different groups, within the races, at the same time. And so I'll give you an anecdote from my life that drives this home a little bit for me. You know, my wife has memories growing up of being followed in stores, being followed in department stores by managers, by clerks, people who just took a look at her, you know, dark-skinned girl, you know, from an urban area and so forth, and just saying, okay, this is somebody we've got to watch and make sure it doesn't steal anything. My wife, when she was a teenager, literally had the experience of going to a store with a white friend of hers, being followed by the manager of the store, while her white friend exploited the situation to actually steal things, you know, without attracting the suspicion of anybody. But the story about myself I was going to tell was, growing up, I never got any of that treatment, you know. And now some folks might say it's because I'm lighter complexioned and whatnot, hair a certain texture, so on and so forth. That may have something to do with it, but I also was raised to speak in a way to where, even though I can code switch pretty quickly, because I was always bouncing back and forth from different environments, in my father's house, I was always encouraged to speak, quote, the King's English, right? So shout out to you guys, I guess. You know, my dad always told me to, you know, look at Martin Luther King Jr., speak the way he spoke, you know, enunciate your vowels, you know, differentiate your consonants, so on and so forth. And so I think that I was kind of bred in a way to sort of fit into the institutional kind of mainstream of American life in a way that a lot of Black people don't have that same on-ramp into. But I can remember at the age of 16 or so, after wearing my hair kind of like this, sort of standard kind of crew cut for a long time, I grew my hair out. I grew an afro and then I braided it, or so I had my hair braided. So I had cornrows, like Allen Iverson or Snoop Dogg or something like that. And it was funny because when I stepped onto campus the day after getting my hair braided, all the Black folks, particularly the ones who had been, bussed in from inner city LA to go to school in Culver City, which is a different group of Black folks from the suburban Black kids who lived, near me. Everybody stopped, everybody looked at me, and suddenly I got a round of applause from folks. Like, finally, right? Brother is like rocking his hair in a way that makes him a part of the culture. Like, all right, welcome on board, So Black folks kind of, there's a little bit more of a visceral warmth that came at me because of that change. But white folks, particularly white folks who didn't know me but just saw me walking around, suddenly started responding to me differently. And at first, I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I just noticed that eye contact was kind of harder to sustain in the grocery store. I noticed that it sort of felt like some people might be standing a little bit further away from me. And then finally, thinking I had figured it out, I put it to the test. I was walking to the bus stop after school one day. There was a white guy who was walking down the street. He was, dressed like he was just leaving the office for his lunch break or something. He sort of started to look over at me, and then he kind of looked down. And then I went to say something to him. I said, hello. I said, excuse me. And I had to say it sort of a few times before he looked up with a little bit of a concerned expression. And I said, oh, pardon me, sir. I said, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I'm on my way to catch the bus, and I just realized I might be a few minutes behind, and I'm hoping I didn't miss it. Could you tell me what time it is? And he sort of sighed in relief a little bit. I could see it. He sort of, so exhaled a little, and he looked at his phone, and he said, it's 3:05. And I said, oh, thank you so much. I said, I think I'll make it. He said, you're welcome. You have a great day. I said, you too. So what does that tell me? This man is not a racist. The color of my skin didn't bother him, but the way I was wearing my hair sent a cultural signal to him that I think made him think like this might be one of those Black people, right? And so that's the thing. When you have an ethnic look in the United States, it triggers connections to certain stereotypes, things, to certain rap videos, folks might be used to seeing, certain episodes of Cops, whatnot, And certainly if you dress a certain way, if you have a certain body language, if your dialect, seems to be kind of like too Black, too ethnic, you're going to trigger certain images in people's minds that they're culturally used to seeing as representations of, if not all Black people, then a certain type of Black person. And so that explains a lot to me with respect to, police relationships and Black people in the community. It explains a lot to me in terms of why my relationship with my teachers, because I wasn't a good student in school. I liked to study, I just didn't like to do my homework, I didn't like to do what was assigned to me. But my relationships with my teachers were much less tense than the relationships my teachers had with some of the Black kids who were bussed in, from inner city LA. It explains a lot of things to me, and yet I still feel like the power of, that real integration only is possible if we are strong enough and resilient enough to deal with that judgmentalism, because ultimately, the only way we win people over to understanding who we are is if we try and see who authentically they are behind whatever, cultural misunderstanding they might have about us. So let me pause and just see what you make of that.
No, I think that's fascinating. And it's something I relate to that on many levels. Okay, so the experience that your wife had with being followed around by security guards. So I had a very similar experience growing up. So I remember it was Virgin Megastores, and I used to love going in, and I used to love listening to the vinyl. I didn't have a vinyl player at home, and I would listen to vinyl and pretend like I was a DJ or something like that. So probably scratching up the records, and I would go on my own. And I'm a
DJ, right? Are you a DJ? Or?
I mean, now I can DJ, but at that point I couldn't. So yeah, I do it more like a hobby than I would say I am a DJ. Okay. But I do play out sometimes, and so I am quite a small woman, like I'm 5 foot tall. And so when I was maybe 12, I was probably a lot shorter. And I've always kind of had a certain appearance that many would, I guess, consider to be urban, or some might consider to be tomboyish or something like that. And so this woman did follow me around, but then I, as a stylist, I'm a fashion stylist, and I very much understand the way our aesthetic communicates certain things about us. And so when I was young, I was quite likely to perceive that to be racial. And now that I'm older, I look back on that situation because, let's say, you know, working class white people can also have an aesthetic, you know, or, and not all, of course, I'm largely generalizing, but let's say when we think of someone maybe white who is, let's say, a stereotype of someone who is lower working class, you know, we might think of a so-called wife beater. We may think of like a sweatpants. We may think of maybe, you know, all kinds of like symbolism that kind of relates to one's class position and social status. And those people are likely to experience very similar things, you know, because we do make judgments about, and everyone does it, of all races, you know, because our clothing, which is why we dress in a certain way, we do dress in ways often that suggest how we want to be received, or maybe we dress in ways that suggest the types of culture and things that we're into. And we put out signals and we respond to those signals, you know, and that's because, you know, our brains are, you know, similar to, let's say, a computer. So we store data, right, you know, and this is how we make sense of the world. And so I do believe that, you know, everybody does, we all have stereotypes. However, what we can learn, so I don't think there's much point necessarily in denying that. And I don't think that's wrong to have stereotypes. I think that's just something we naturally do to make sense of things. However, we don't have to act on our stereotypes, on our judgments, you know, and that's maybe the place that we are trying to get to. I mean, there might be some instances where acting on stereotypes might even be protective. So let's say I, a woman, am out late. Let's say I'm walking home, 1 a.m. There's a group of drunk males, you know, on one side of the street, and they're quite loud. And they seem like they're, you know, being quite boisterous with each other. And I can see other women passing and then, you know, shouting whatever. You know, I might make the judgment based on their level of intoxication, how they're behaving, maybe their dress code, that I might cross the road. You know, that doesn't necessarily mean that I have to treat those individuals, if one was to approach me, in a negative way necessarily, but it might just mean that I might have to be cautious. And so I think sometimes, and these things can be uncomfortable, but I think we have to embrace the fact that our aesthetic and the things that we choose to value through our dress codes and things like that, you know, they do have messages attached to them. And that doesn't mean that those messages are right, you know, but someone acting on them doesn't mean that they're always doing it from a place of hatred, let's say.
Well, look, if you're a Black person in the United States, and you're in a certain part of the South, or a certain part of, say, rural California or whatnot, and you just happen to be in a small town, let's say, or passing through somewhere, and you see a group of white folks who are dressed in khaki pants, wife beaters. They've got bald heads and black boots and whatnot, and tattoos. As a Black person, that's probably not a group of people that you're just going to try and walk, right through, in a given place, because, those visual cues might suggest that these are the types of white folks who might be a little bit more aggressive towards people who look like you. And by the way, you might, of course, be wrong in that assumption. There are plenty of white folks out there with bald heads, who wear black boots, who listen to, heavy metal and whatnot, who are going to be the greatest, nicest, sweetest people you've ever met. But that stereotype, comes from something in the Black experience. And so a Black person wouldn't, I think you couldn't blame a Black person for being cautious in a situation like that, or at least feeling like they should be, But I think that the larger point is that there is, just sort of the arc of social evolution, I think, in human history towards a more inclusive society is sort of the process of us first getting to know each other generally and having mass interactions across groups where we have to make generalized judgments, and where our ancestors made to make general judgments about one another in contexts that for political and other reasons, did not may have led to a lot of hostility or subjugation. It is the process of moving from that to getting to know each other on greater and greater levels of empathy, and greater levels of intimacy, I should say, opening doors for a clearer understanding of who we are, as individuals, but also sort of where the humanity in the cultural differences lies, right? Mm-hmm. And so that process is one, I think, that has been facilitated through simple proximity, through political struggle and agitation, through education, through philosophy, through intermarriage, through music, through love, through sex, through all of these different things, there is a way in which we come to know each other better and better over time, and we become part of each other more and more over time. And so when I look at our current moment, I try and embrace philosophical points of view that open the lane for that kind of coming together, right? And so in the context of my work and just the American context, for me, there is a philosophical foundation for that way of being in the world that has been tremendously successful in American history, and that I imagine has probably influenced life in Great Britain, and yet has kind of vanished from popular articulation, and that is the philosophy of nonviolence. Well, of course, it comes to us through Gandhi and through King in the United States of America, primarily through King, but King was inspired by Gandhi. And the interesting thing about the philosophy of nonviolence is that it calls upon even persecuted people to love their enemies and to voluntarily take on the burden of speaking to the humanity in the person who is oppressing you. And for two reasons. Reason number one, because it makes you more effective in terms of being able to signal to that person that you're not an enemy, that you see that there's good in them, even if they are doing bad things. It makes them more apt to respond to you positively, to change them. And two, even if you're not able to do that, you unshackle the burden of hatred and bitterness from yourself so that you don't have to walk around with the albatross of, being infected by other people's hate. You don't have to carry that with you day to day, and it makes you stronger and more resilient as a result. And that is the substance of the application of love as a social philosophy, as a social value, I should say. That is the basis of nonviolence. So I'm wondering, I suppose, in your work and in your commentary, are there philosophical roots that you have from studies that you've conducted, or things in history that help frame your own kind of narrative point of view?
Yeah, and I would say nonviolence and people like Dr. King and Gandhi and a lot of Buddhist teachers. I think they've been very influential on me. A lot of philosophy too. And what I see is, it's easier to understand your, let's say, so-called enemy. This isn't my language, but maybe some people would see certain people as their enemy or their oppressor, and all of these people, when you are able to recognize such tendencies within yourself. And so when you are able to recognize the darker forces that are at work within yourself, I think that helps you see a lot of people clearer. And for me, anger, which isn't to say that anger doesn't have a place, But to live in anger is not something that I would recommend for anyone, although we often frame it as a very radical way of being. But I think it's a very, what would be the word? I think it's a very instinctive, you do it almost without thinking, you don't have much control sometimes. And I would like to live, this short life that we have, taking control of my feelings, making choices rather than being led by compulsion, And so a lot of behavior that is more hostile and aggressive is compulsion, it's our compulsions. It's us acting without thinking. But it's a lot harder to take the time to be understanding, because to understand other people, you have to understand yourself. And so for me, I do believe that there is a great place, for non-violence, for understanding. My whole thing, if I'm honest, is about understanding. But I think that primarily comes with understanding ourselves first. And like I said, in all contexts, even the worst, I do not think that we are that different. In the same way that, you gave a great example when you spoke about the sort of visceral reaction that maybe the average Black American could feel when coming across that white guy in khaki shorts and a wife beater with black boots, and we have that association from past events, from movies, from actual violent acts that have happened. And equally, there is a stereotype about, let's say, Black criminality. There's a look to it. Mm-hmm. There's a look to it that other people are also receiving, And so in the same ways that we may want to be hostile towards someone with that type of appearance, is the same way that someone, out of fear, because it would be fear on both ends. It's fear when a Black American may act that way towards this person in khaki shorts. And it's also fear in this white individual who may act that way, let's say, to someone in like a baggy white tee, and some Jordans and cornrows rather. So when we recognize that, we too are not without prejudice, whether we want to call that racism now or not, because I know there's arguments to say that, academic arguments to say that Black people cannot be racist. Whether, it's semantics to me, whether you want to call it racism or not, we can all be racially insensitive. We can be prejudiced. We can be discriminatory. The word doesn't necessarily matter. And so I really do think that, a lot of the time how I perceive things, and maybe that's because I come from a fairly, and I think you do too, I come from a fairly humanistic standpoint. Maybe some people would call it a spiritual standpoint. I really do think that, a lot of the war that we're having outwards is with our own unconsciousness. I think we can often really dislike the things that are chilling reminders of ourselves that we haven't checked out, and I see this in myself sometimes, like there's been people when I was younger specifically that I just didn't like, there was no reason to not like them. I just didn't, and then as I maybe became slightly more self-aware, I was like, oh, that's because they're me, that's because like, I'm just like that, and I think, for one, there's something humorous in that, but I think that's the way that we start to overcome some of the fears that we have about each other when we recognize that, we're just different manifestations of the same thing.
Right. Yeah, there's a verse in Romans that says something along the lines of, be wary of judging others, for in everything that you judge another, you condemn in yourself. And there is this sort of funny way in which it is so difficult for us to see what is lacking in our own characters, but it's so easy to see what's wrong with other people. And maybe that's just kind of the way in which some folks have to kind of start off on the road of self-discovery. You've got to endure the consequences of obsessing over other people's faults until your own actually manage to become apparent, right? So let's dig in our final minutes into the spiritual dimension of this, because I do think that there, even if you're coming from a secular perspective, I think that there's clearly something that we call a spiritual dynamic to life and to existence. And one of the things that people comment on is the fact that there is in Christianity, but I think there's sort of an analog to this in Buddhism and other faiths. There's this assumption that we are starting our journey in sin, or we are starting our journey in ignorance. We are starting from a place of imperfection, right? We all have a path towards growth, a path towards enlightenment, a path towards salvation, but it requires, in the Christian tradition, it requires looking inward, it requires repentance, it requires atoning, but at the same time, recognizing that the role of your judgmentalism is reserved for yourself, not primarily for other people, right? So we speak the truth to other people, but as is the case in nonviolence, you speak the truth to other people with a heart that wants to do good for them, not with a heart that wants to condemn them, right? And you do that, as an outgrowth of love. And in order to be a vehicle for that love, you have to know that you are loving within yourself. And so anything that is not of love within yourself is not of God, and therefore needs to be repented for. So in these in these traditions of faith and in these spiritual narratives, there's this way in which the way we are supposed to be in the world is constantly reflecting on ourselves, the ways in which we are wrong, and using that internal reflection to grow so we can lift other people up so they can be better too. And I think that the kind of, the sort of social, and some people refer to this as a religion in and of itself, but the type of justice-seeking culture that is expressing itself in certain quarters, at least currently, seems to have an approach to where there is sort of a demand that people already be on a certain level of understanding, that people already be on a certain level of wokeness or awareness, and that if you're not on that level already, you pay a price for it. You need to sort of be taken down for that in order to make space for the emergence of a social reality that is pinned to a standard that nobody can actually live up to, because we all have our ignorance, we all have our prejudice and so forth. Now, to be fair, I listen to folks like Ibram Kendi, for instance, who on the one hand makes the argument that to be white in America is to be racist in essence, and yet we still need to be patient with white folks as they grow out of their racism. And so I understand that there are ways of articulating that are more or less generous. But the aggregate sort of effect that I see is that you've got all sorts of people now, sort of prostrating themselves and feeling like, one, deeply feeling that they can never be sufficiently, I don't want to belabor the term woke, but they can never be sufficiently aware to really make up for the irredeemable depth of sin that is associated with, say, their whiteness or their privilege or what have you. You have this dynamic there. Or on the other hand, you have people, with white folks, again, specifically, who feel that, well, there's nothing wrong with me, but if I don't performatively try and conform to this language that people need me to speak, I might lose everything. And so, there's bitterness breeding in that, and an inauthenticity that comes through when a person is forcing him or herself to be an ally according to this kind of way of looking at things. And so I see chaos and confusion because there's just no universal pathway towards human redemption. Everything is sort of consigned to, your particular formula for how you need to be in the world is tethered to your starting point of privilege, your particular identity, and how you fit within the social construct of American life based on an inequitable history. And even though that history is real, even though these structures are what they are and and we can say that things need to be addressed, things need to be reformed, there's still got to be a human starting point for what it means to be a good person. Because you said it wonderfully in a talk that you gave, and I said something very similar the other day. You said that there's a difference between, being good opinions do not make good people, and what I tweeted out is it was totally coincidental, but just the other day, what I had tweeted out was, opinions do not equal character.
They don't. Yeah, exactly. And it seems in our culture at the moment, maybe more so than ever, I have the suspicion that people have often been like this. I don't think it's very new, but I think in the digital regime, if you like, it's a lot more apparent and palpable. But people seem to think that, it's their beliefs rather than their behavior that determines one's morality, And so let's say you might have all of the right socio-political perspectives, let's say you are an avid supporter of the LGBTQ community, you're up to date on all of the feminist lingo. However, you're not a generous person. You're very mean-spirited. You're judgmental. You're quick to aggression. That seems not to matter. What seems to matter to people is that you have the right opinions. However, there could be someone who doesn't have these so-called right opinions, who, maybe through his own type of ignorance, fear, sense of attack on his manhood, sometimes makes gay jokes. He makes gay jokes about, let's say when he thinks something is weak, he is likely to refer to it as gay, something that's, somewhat insensitive, let's say, like that. But, he's dependable.
I did as a teenager and whatnot.
Right.
We all did. The boys that I grew up with, it was just part of the lexicon, that we thought was okay,
Most gay people did, exactly. So it's not even something that's unique to straight people, And so let's say this guy, he does make these jokes, but he's dependable, he's a good listener. He's generous, he's there for his family. That doesn't seem to matter to us.
Right.
What matters is us judging him by what we believe to be morality. And it's a very narrow thing, and it's a very political thing. And as much as we have this slogan that flies around that, the personal is political, we are not only politics, we're more than that.
Right.
And I think we lose that. I think we're losing our sense of that. And I think it's because, for a lot of people, and maybe it's a reality, a lot of people see their lives to be a battlefield, so they're constantly at war. And so maybe they don't think they can ever divorce the human from the political. However, if politics isn't making you wiser, and if you're not becoming more understanding, I mean, if you're walking around in fear, or constantly searching for ill intention in people, what life, what kind of quality of life are you allowing yourself?
That's right. Yeah, because whether you're white or black or on the right or on the left, if that is your attitude day to day towards your political and social opposites, it means that what's going on internally, what's going on within your heart and within your mind, it is a storm of bitterness, judgmentalism, and iniquity in and of itself. And so that is what you are sending out into the world in the name of pursuing justice, or in the name of pursuing liberty or equality, or whatever ideal wrapper of idealism we might put around that. And yet, understanding that human relationships are built upon a truly kind of authentic, understanding developing between people, something that pierces appearances and differences in language and understanding, it seems to me that love being the root motivator of human action within a person is the thing that therefore presents us with the most viable pathway to a truly more just and equal society for all people over time. Because ultimately, we need to safeguard these things together through our relationships with one another if they're truly going to endure as benefits for our society as a whole, I think. And so, you know, in the work that we do at Braver Angels, one of the beautiful things that I get to observe on a regular basis is this thing that happens where you'll have somebody, you know, from the left and from the right, somebody from very different cultural experiences. And because we sort of try and create the space to where we depersonalize disagreement, but we still preserve the authenticity of disagreement, the real intensity of it, you are able to sort of surface the disagreements in a way to where the tension of the disagreements become clear. But the way we are relating to each other in the context of the conversation is to recognize, you know, the goodness of the character and the motivations that is at work, even when the disagreements are profound. And so you can see a disagreement, you can see a tension between perspectives at the same time that you can recognize a harmony between hearts. And in that moment, you know, you see that, you know, there is this possibility, there is this beloved community that is waiting to be formed, where we can clarify our disagreements by willingness to really engage each other, but build upon, you know, the things that actually unite us as human beings. You know, we just have to keep the first thing from obscuring the second thing, you know, and if we can do that, then we can make a better world. So.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. It's about maybe, learning how to critique the idea rather than the people, you know, and yeah, not necessarily, you know, I think we have a tendency to see, we have a tendency to take everything personally, you know, and a lot of people's hostile, aggressive, and negative behavior, I think when we can learn to see that that's more of a reflection of who they are, rather a symbol of our own worth, you know, I think this helps, or, you know, it at least helps me anyway. Like when I recognize that, you know, this is only a portrait of your own internal suffering, if you like, or your own internal instability, rather than anything to do with me.
Indeed. Well, Ayisha, I sort of feel like we're just getting started, and I think that we are. It just means that this conversation is going to have to go onward. Pardon me. City living. That's what you're.
No, me too. I mean, it's been quiet for you, but it never generally is. So no, I'm glad to know I'm not alone in that.
Okay, no, you are not by any means. This has been a real pleasure, and I look forward to continuing this conversation, because I think that there's a universal project that we're working on here, you know, to build what I term the beloved community, but, you know, to build a society across all these divides that brings out the best in us. And love is where you start with that. And you've been a wonderful voice for that. So I just want to thank you for sharing your time with me today. I really do.
Thank you for having me.
100%. And so folks who are listening, if you are interested in the work of Braver Angels, if you want to hear more about these conversations and be involved in work on the ground or in the digital space to build out the culture of dialogue, collaboration, and community building in the United States so we can get to that more perfect union, then join us, become a member at braverangels.org. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. This is Braver Angels. We are building a house united, and we will talk to you next time. Until then.